right, good morning, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. So I'm Erin Grunzy. I'm the Executive Director of the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin. Most of you I do know, and if I haven't been able to speak with you yet, I hope to be able to connect with you today. Thank you for joining us for our presentation and speaker training on National Popular Vote. We're very excited to have Eileen Reavey, did I say it right? Here, and we're very excited that we have a strong representation from leagues across the state, and we're hoping to continue to grow that out. And so just a real quick brief history about how this all got started, and kudos to those who have done so much for this group to really grow some roots and spread and grow. So Barbara Patrick from Green Bay League was really interested in the issue. She connected with some other league members outside of Wisconsin and other states who were also interested in the issue, got connected with LWVWI and how we can help educate and advocate on this issue of the national popular vote, since the league has a position in that. And I won't go through that history because that'll take a lot longer, but it's also a very interesting history. So Barbara joined the legislative committee and wanted to take on this issue, monitor it, track it, educate on it, and get more people on board, especially through the league. So what we did was we launched a working group, and if you're part of that working group, if you don't mind standing up, because I think that you should be acknowledged for your contribution. So I would like to applaud each of you and thank you so very much. So because of Barbara's determination and our individuals in the working group, Dorothy, Marilyn, Posey, Irene, who are here today, and a few others who couldn't join us today, because of their good work, their steady work on this, they've created a toolkit, which they will talk about later, and have brought in a speaker like Eileen to come and help educate us and further this training and understanding on this important initiative. So I just want to give a shout out to that, because a lot of people will say, wow, your state's doing so much about this, and they often will look at the state office, and I'm very clear that this doesn't happen unless we have the work behind it from members who are motivated, committed to putting time and energy behind it. Our office can help with resources, but really, if it isn't for the membership behind to do the big lift, to get the organizing done, things like this don't happen. And I just want to say, awesome that this has happened. So with that, I'll introduce Barbara Patrick with the Green Bay League, who will introduce our speaker. And I just want to give one more quick shout out and thank you to the Green Bay League, who helped put together today's event. Did a lot of background and logistics, and helped bring us together into this space today. So a big thank you to the Green Bay members. All right, go ahead, Barbara.
Okay. So as Erin just said, I'm Barb Patrick. First of all, I also want to include Erin. She is part of our working group also, and she does a lot of work and coordination with the State League. So I'm here today, right now, to introduce our speaker, Eileen Reavey. Eileen is a consultant based in Portland, Oregon, and she's worked on issues ranging from food waste to green buildings to affordable housing. In 2016, she moved to the West Coast, and after graduate school, put her nonprofit organizing skills to work in the world of political organizing. She co-founded the Grassroots advocacy group for National Popular Vote in Oregon in 2016, and she now serves as National Popular Vote's National Grassroots Director. And one fun fact is, Wisconsin, is the 11th state she has visited on behalf of National Popular Vote. So without more, here's Eileen Reavey, fresh from Portland, Oregon.
Thank you for that introduction. I'm just going to take 1 minute here to make sure my computer doesn't go to sleep again. All right, thank you all so much for being here this morning. As Barb said, I'm Eileen Reavey. National Popular Vote is a nonprofit whose sole mission is to pass the National Popular Vote Compact so that the winner of the nationwide popular vote for president becomes the president every time. This effectively makes every vote for president equal. We are a nonpartisan organization, similar to the League, advocating for a bipartisan bill which both benefits and suffers from bipartisan support and bipartisan opposition. The format of this presentation, for the first 90 minutes, I'm going to explain the history of the Electoral College, how we elect the president currently, and our proposal in a really kind of like deep level, nitty-gritty way. I'll then transition into breaking down and responding to some of the items that come up the most often when people have questions or off the bat they're opposed to it, and how to respond to those items. And then I'll have ample time for questions at the end. We'll do a short lunch break, and then in the afternoon we'll have an hour for how to be an effective grassroots advocate for national popular vote, and have some time for some updates from the League. Is this a good volume for everyone? Okay, great. So does everyone have a packet? Okay, great. So just to kind of go over this briefly, this is my card, so you all can contact me if you have questions afterwards. The colorful note card is if you have any feedback or suggestions for how I can do better with this presentation in the future, which I super appreciate. And then it's just a couple of the most high-level documents from National Popular Vote. Sometimes when some of my colleagues do these presentations, they print off about 100 pages per person. That is not my personal style, so I printed the ones that I think are the absolute most important, and that will be most talked about here. And then afterwards, I hope that you all, when you signed in, gave your email address, and then I'll be able to share all the kind of more dense documents if you are interested in them, and they'll also be available on Google Drive. All right, so we're going to start with the easy place. How does America elect our president? As you all know, we use the Electoral College. So on Election Day, you and I cast our ballots for the candidate of our choice, but the real vote is in December, when electors meet in their respective state houses and cast their ballots. There are 538 electors, and they're actually the people who decide the president. States are allocated one electoral vote for every representative that they have in Congress, which means that every state starts off with two electors for each senator and one for each member of the House. You need to become the president, you need 270 electoral votes, which is a majority of the Electoral College. So, how did we get this Electoral College? At the Constitutional Convention, the founders went back and forth on how to elect the president. They eventually came up with the compromise of having states be granted electors who would vote on behalf of the states. Then they debated for many days about how those electors would be chosen. Over 22 days, they took 30 different votes on how those electors should be chosen, and they did not come to a consensus. So what they ultimately decided to do was to leave it up to the individual states to decide how their electors would vote. They just said, hey, the state legislature, that's the closest governmental body to the people. They can decide what is best for the voters in their state. So, who are these electors? What the Constitution says is exactly what I just said, but more formally, each state shall appoint, in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct, a number of electors equal to the whole number of senators and representatives to which the state need be entitled in Congress. That is all the Constitution says about how the electors are chosen. What this has evolved to, and what we currently have, is a system of winner-take-all laws. So 48 states and the District of Columbia choose electors based on whoever received the most votes in their state on Election Day. So this is what's referred to as statewide winner-take-all, and I'll explain a little bit later how the other two states allocate their electors, but the vast majority use these winner-take-all laws, which is the current system that we have. So this is what gives us the type of map that we're used to, where states are decidedly red or decidedly blue. I like to share a fun tidbit. In 5th grade, I had an assignment where I had to follow along on TV to color in states as they were called on election night. And I liked blue, and my parents were Republicans, and so I thought, okay, I'm gonna color in every Republican state blue. As you can guess, this got very confusing very quickly. It was a worksheet from my school. I did not have an option to just print out another copy, so it was a very frustrating night. I'll show my age a little bit. This was actually the 2000 election, so on top of this, I went to bed, my mom said, they haven't called Florida. When you wake up, you'll know who the president is. Don't worry about it, go to sleep. So I wake up eager and like nervous, I gotta finish my assignment, and we did not know who the president was. And we did not know for many weeks, as you all know. I like to say that this is where my interest in this topic really came from. I've been bothered about this for many years. So, the Founding Fathers did not come up with these winner-take-all laws. They were not voted on or proposed at the Constitutional Convention. So the founders never envisioned an election like we have today. In the very first presidential election, only 5 states allowed citizens to vote for the candidate in any way. In the third presidential election, we had Thomas Jefferson running against John Adams. So this was really our first presidential election, since the first 2, George Washington ran unopposed. So in the third presidential election, Adams wins by 3 electoral votes. This is important because Adams was able to cherry pick those electors out of states that Jefferson would have otherwise won, and in districts that he thought he was going to win. And he thought, well, that's not fair. I wanted to be the next president of the United States, and instead he was vice president. So Thomas Jefferson and James Madison got together to change Virginia state law, because Jefferson was a son of Virginia, so that all of the electors go to whoever the most people in Virginia pick. So this was the first instance of a winner-take-all law, and was done because Jefferson wanted to be president. And he knew that Virginia would always go for him, and Virginia was the biggest state at the time. So this set off a race between states for them to change their law. Pennsylvania was next, and it just went this back and forth system of people doing it for the wrong reasons. They're changing state law to try and rig the system and benefit themselves or the candidate of their choice, instead of doing what would most accurately reflect people. Yes?
I'm not clear, before the winner-take-all, it was proportional?
Oh, great question. So before that, in different states, it was different. Sometimes the governor would just appoint. It was very different than the system we have today. The governor could just choose who the electors were if he wanted to. In some states, the state legislatures would just pick people. So there wasn't this, like how we have today, where people vote and you think, okay, based on this, per congressional district or statewide, they're going to get the electors. Back in the 1700s and 1800s, the legislature could just pick people, and that was it. Yeah, very different than the system that we have today. So it wasn't actually until the 11th election that a majority of states used winner-take-all. So the Founding Fathers were dead long before we actually had the system that we're all familiar with today. This is not what they envisioned. They envisioned states doing what was best for them. What we've had more recently is where we have the system of battleground states and flyover states, and I'll define those a little bit later. But that wasn't what they intended. They intended for the states to decide what was best for them, which is a part of what I'm going to be advocating for here. So, what we know today, in California, if the Democrat receives the most votes, they get all 55 of California's electoral votes. Same thing in Texas. If the Republican candidate receives the most votes, they get all of Texas's 38 electoral votes. So in 2016, if you are one of the 4.5 million Californians who cast a ballot for Donald Trump, or one of the 3.8 million Texans who cast a ballot for Hillary Clinton, your vote was effectively thrown out. The electors went to cast their ballot in December and said, well, this candidate got more votes in my state, so they get 100% of our electoral votes. So these winner-take-all laws, these state laws, are how we end up with divergent elections, where the popular vote winner is the electoral college loser. So these are not just a modern phenomenon, even though we've had this twice pretty recently. We have actually had 5 in our country's history, where the candidate who received fewer votes nationwide became the president. Most recently, it has denied 2 Democrats the presidency. But in 2004, if 60,000 more voters in Ohio had cast their ballot for John Kerry instead of George Bush, John Kerry would have won the state of Ohio, he would have won the Electoral College, he would have become the president, despite having a popular vote loss almost equal to the margin that Donald Trump did. Almost 3 million more people voted for George Bush, 60,000 voters had voted the other way in Ohio, and John Kerry would have been the 44th president. So 60,000 votes might sound like a lot, right? That's a lot of people. But when we're talking about 121 million votes that were cast in the 2004 election, 60,000 voters is not that much. That's a small amount of people to shift an entire presidential election. So under our current system, 60,000 votes in Ohio, 11,000 votes in Michigan, 68,000 votes in Pennsylvania. These small differences swing the outcome of the election for the entire country and have greater weight than millions of votes cast elsewhere in the country. So this is how we end up with this system of states being decidedly red or decidedly blue, and candidates for the general election only campaign in a small number of closely divided states. These are what we refer to as swing states or battleground states. So in 2012, all of the general election campaign events were concentrated in just 12 states. That's what this map is of, showing you the number of campaign events in each state. On this map, and pretty much for the entire presentation, just know when I say campaign events, I am referring to general election campaign events, not the primary, because in the primary, candidates go lots of different places, but the general campaign. So in these 12 states in 2012, Republican nominee Mitt Romney had support between 45 and 51% in every single one of these states. Just a 6% swing made it so that he knew, all right, I have a fighting chance. If it was below 45%, he didn't go there. He said, I'm not going to win that state. If it was above 51, he said, oof, thanks for your electoral votes. I know I can count on them on election day. I don't need to go and listen to what issues are important to you. So if you look at the West Coast, where I live, no campaign visits. Almost the entire South except for Florida. Most of New England, huge pockets of the breadbasket of America are completely ignored in the 2012 election for president. Beyond that, 2/3 of these events were in just 4 states. So Ohio, Florida, Virginia, and Iowa saw 2/3 of the entire campaign events for the entire country, just 4 states. 38 states were completely ignored, including 12 of the 13 smallest states, and almost, as I said earlier, all of rural, agricultural, southern, western, and northeastern America. So, in the 2012 election, America didn't really look like our typical America to our candidates. They looked like this. So, what pops out pretty clearly here? Those states again, Iowa, Florida, Virginia, Wisconsin. Good, you got some visits. Good job, you guys are often a battleground state. But what about the 38 other states? What about huge portions of the country? Texas, New York, California, no visits at all. They didn't matter, which means by extension that the voters in those states did not matter to the candidates. Their issues were not talked about in debates. Their issues did not become campaign platform pieces. It didn't matter because they already knew how that state was going to go, so the individual voters in that state, it didn't really factor into what the candidate was going to decide was important. Ballots cast anywhere other than a closely divided battleground state just don't influence the outcome of the election. So I want to be clear that I'm using maps for this example for 2012, But this is not unique to 2012. Similarly, in 2016, which is what this map represents, virtually all campaign events, 94%, were in just 12 states again. In those 12 states, Donald Trump's support was between 43% and 51%. So a little bit of a bigger margin there, but still pretty close. And the reason I say virtually all campaign events, it was 94%, and the reason it wasn't 100% was because, as we know, Donald Trump was a little bit of a different candidate. He liked then and still does now to do rallies wherever he would do a fundraiser. So that is how we ended up with one event in California, one in Washington, one in Texas. But those are far and away drowned out by the 71 campaign events in Florida, the 48 campaign events in Ohio, 54 in Pennsylvania, 55 in North Carolina, 22 events in Michigan, and 23 in Virginia. Those 6 states that I just mentioned, you notice Wisconsin was not among them, they were home to 2/3 of all campaign events in the 2016 general election. So we had a similar pattern. We've always had battleground states, and they tend to shift, but this intense concentration where 2/3 of all campaign events are in just 4, 6, 5 states. That happened in 2000, 2004, 2008, and as I've shown you, 2012 and 2016. And unsurprisingly, we are expecting this again for the 2020 election, where the big states are expected currently to be Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Florida. So what's important here is that it's not just about campaign events. It goes far beyond that. So this book by Dr. John Hudak, it's a little technical, but I recommend it if you are really interested in what I'm about to talk about. So he did a dissertation for his PhD, and out of that he made a book. And so it's really very technical with lots of charts and stuff. But so overall, controlling for variables such as state size and natural disaster relief funds, presidential election swing states received 7.6% more federal grants than safe states. And that represented 5.7% more grant money between 1996 and 2008. So although all states experienced an increase in grant money in the 2 years leading up to an election, that makes sense, right? Your government wants to show you that they're taking care of you when you're getting ready to vote again. But swing states in that time received 9% more grants, representing 7% more grant money. Now, it's not just about re-election, too, because this pattern prevails in the 2 years leading up to any election, which isn't super surprising because presidents and their administrations generally prefer for the next president to be of their same political party. So it's this inherent sense that, okay, well, yeah, Ohio really matters, Wisconsin really matters, and that bias of, okay, well, let's approve those grants. Now, some of these are going to be totally biased and intentional, and some might not. Some are those things in the back of the head of the administration of, oh, okay, yeah, we can approve this grant. But when I'm talking about 7.6% more federal grants and 5.7% more grant money, that equates to really, really big dollars. So if Tennessee had been a swing state in 2008, based on this modeling that Dr. Hudak did, they would have expected to get 300 more federal grants for a total of $60 million in 2007. Imagine how far $60 million can go in rural parts of Tennessee. That is a huge amount of money that can have serious positive implications for people's lives and certainly helps the state budgets. And these are benefits that only swing states are getting, and they're only getting them the 2 years leading up to an election. Because you certainly believe Colorado is no longer a swing state. They're no longer going to benefit from this system. At some point in the future, Wisconsin is likely to not be a swing state again, and any insurgence of funds that you're getting now is not going to happen down the road. Same thing goes with disaster declarations. Highly competitive swing states get twice as many disaster declarations as non-competitive flyover states. A lot of money comes with these. Like, this is Hurricane Sandy level disaster relief declarations. And you think that they would be based on the severity of the disaster, the amount of lives impacted, how many billions of dollars of damage was done to the state. Those are factors, but getting twice as many disaster declarations in swing states, that's not a trivial thing that you can ignore. Twice as many is a huge amount, billions of dollars of support. So, what does this all really mean? Battleground states have more power. They have more campaign events. They get more federal grants, more disaster declarations, and this is all more power for them because all of these visits and funding are a proxy for power and in our political system. So it goes beyond funding of these grants and disaster declarations as well. And it goes beyond, honestly, like the infusion of cash a battleground state would get from people coming in for campaign events, doing large-scale public events, the media dollars that are spent in state. It goes beyond that, and it goes into policy. So No Child Left Behind was proposed by a Republican candidate for president who needed to win over minivan driving moms in Ohio. When he was eventually elected by the state of Ohio, this bill was signed in the Cincinnati suburbs in 2001. And I'm going to quote my Republican colleague who is not able to be here with me today, but what he always refers to this as is the largest federal intrusion into public education in the history of our country. Is that something you would expect from a Republican candidate? Not traditionally. By the way, in the years that this was signed into law, after 2001, battleground states were also twice as likely to get exemptions from No Child Left Behind. Yeah. And it goes both ways. In March of 2012, so a re-election year, President Obama pledged to create up to 15 manufacturing centers nationwide, and the first federal grant went to the state of Ohio. Now it goes beyond just the fact that he got the first state, because when the Obama administration awarded tax credits to promote clean energy, Ohio companies got nearly 4 times the average as every other state. 4 times as much of these rebates went to businesses in Ohio than did any other state because it was that critically important to the 2012 election. Again, this largest small business administration loan in the history of the country went to a ricotta cheese manufacturer who was a Cleveland dairy farmer in 2012. This keeps happening because what did we see in 2016? What's happening now? We're in a trade war, right? A Republican president needed to win more traditionally Rust Belt states, and he engaged in protectionist trade policies to protect those states because that's who he needs to win again in 2020. So we have this trade war with these policies that are not what you would, again, typically expect of a Republican candidate at all. Yes?
Would you rather have questions at the end?
Oh, yeah, do you have a question on this very specific thing?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Well, I guess I'm wondering if you had the national popular vote, wouldn't grants be granted to the parties that the president favored anyway? I mean, are we going to be pure after we get the national popular vote? I doubt it.
I'm going to write that down and I will answer that a little bit later on, yeah. And if I don't remember to, please remind me. Okay. So, again, in 2016, the only reason that Donald Trump has any stance on Bears Ears in Utah and why it's now a national monument is because Evan McMullin was running for president in 2016. Some of you might remember that name. He was specifically trying to win the electoral votes in his home state of Utah. And that was his whole thing. He wasn't trying to really win nationwide, but he wanted to win Utah's electoral votes, hoping that that would be denying those votes to the Republican candidate, because he did not like Donald Trump, would be enough to make Donald Trump not the president. So what did Donald Trump do? Donald Trump came out with statements on Utah because it became important to him to win that state. Oh yeah, Bears Ears, yes, let's protect it. And then it became a national monument. So battleground states have the power. They have more visits, more money, more everything. And America pays the price. America pays the price because to top it all off, we get divergent elections. So going back to this idea of divergent elections, as I mentioned, this has happened 5 times in our nation history, where the candidate who has received fewer votes nationwide becomes the president. That is 8.6% of the time. That is not a small amount of time. So this is problematic for a lot of reasons, which I hope you'll agree with me on some or most of them. One person, one vote is a democratic ideal that has been cemented into our sense of democracy over the past 200 years. No, it's not something that was put into our Constitution at our founding, but it is something that people have fought for through the women's right to vote, through the right for people of color to vote. Now we see this more recently with efforts in states for returning citizens that have felony convictions to be able to vote in certain states. And we've had several Supreme Court cases that have cemented this idea of, okay, yes, one person, one vote through the 14th Amendment. That is something that is a part of our country. So that's one. That's what I think is personally the most important. 2, divergent elections create a false crisis of duly elected presidents. So by this I mean we vote, and in every other election, whoever gets the most votes wins. So it feels like a breach of the social contract when we go out on election day and whoever gets the most votes for president doesn't become the president. Even though they are duly elected, that's how our current system works. It causes a lot of people to feel like that person is not who should be in power. I think we certainly see this since the 2016 election with Donald Trump. And I will again quote my Republican colleague because he actually worked in the Bush administration, and how he refers to it as planes had to fly into buildings before people stopped talking about the legitimacy of the 2000 election. That's how extreme it is. That's why it stopped being an issue, because we had a huge attack of terrorism on our country's soil, and that took all the attention, of course. But it took an event like that for us to stop talking about if George Bush was a legitimate president or not. So you can call me crazy, but I want a president who gets the most votes. It's a simple idea. Whoever the majority votes for should become the president. And I want them to have a mandate to get things done. And yes, I will still feel this way if, and presumably when, my preferred candidate does not win under a national popular vote. So, how should we elect the president? One person, one vote, a national popular vote. A popular vote overall, usually within your single state district, is how we elect almost every other person in the country. And it's time we modernize our presidential elections to make every vote being equal. So every vote being equal would mean candidates would have to care about the entire population's interests, not just those in swing states. And we would break the system where candidates advocate for positions that poll well with swing voters in battleground states, such as Medicare Part D that helped George Bush win in Florida, or doing campaign events with coal miners in Pennsylvania. There's more lumberjacks in Oregon than there are coal miners in Pennsylvania, but you don't see any Democrats doing anything with our unions out there. So we're back to this. And now we know America isn't really red or blue and neatly divided along these lines, right? This is what we actually look like. This is a cartogram of the 2016 election. So it shows the larger, like bluer areas are, Southern California, the northwest of the country, where there's pockets of more urban blue areas. But then you have blue and red all interspersed throughout the country because we're a compilation of diverse people with diverse opinions who happen to live in certain states. Not everyone in the state of Oregon is a Democrat, I promise. Just like I'm sure, as you know, because you're in a battleground state, you're an evenly divided state, so it's hard to just say you're a blue state, you're a red state. So I know when I cast my ballot on election day, I do so as an American, not an Oregonian, and that is how we should elect the president. As Americans, not just people that happen to live in our states. So that is where the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact is. And this is our proposed solution to this issue of divergent elections and every vote not being equal across the country. So through the compact, we make every voter in every state politically relevant. We right-size the political power of battleground states by making every vote equal. And we do it through state action, not the abolishment of the Electoral College. The National Popular Vote Bill would guarantee the presidency to the candidate who receives the most popular votes in all 50 states and DC. It does this by replacing state-level winner-take-all laws with new state laws that award their electoral votes to the candidate who wins the popular vote in all 50 states and DC. And the bill only goes into effect when states with 270 electoral votes have been committed to the compact. And that number right now is 270. If at some point we were to add another state, the compact is actually a majority of electoral votes, which matches the language in the Constitution of what you need to win the presidency. So it's a majority of electoral votes, which for a long time has been 270 and probably will be for several more years. So this is not something that is just thought up on a whim. Wisconsin is not the first state to consider this. It has been passed in 15 states and the District of Columbia so far, representing 196 electoral votes. And it's now 2019. This was first passed in the state of Maryland in 2007. So over the past 12 years is how we've gotten these 16 states added on. We have some of those books in the back. You'll see they're pretty thick, which I think goes to show that this is a pretty well thought out plan. This isn't something that just one guy came up with. Yes, those books in the back, they're very dense. This isn't something that just one person came up with and there's like 5 of us going around advocating for. No, this isn't. Yes, one person did come up with the idea, and then they got teams of lawyers to come together and create the best version that they could come up with for the bill. It's 888 words, and it's very well thought out. And what I'll share with you a little bit later is chapter 9 of the book is the most useful one. It's going through the myths that come up, which we're going to cover some of here. But there's over 132 myths that are addressed in that chapter. It is available on our website, National Popular Vote. And anytime someone comes up with a really good new one, we earmark it to put it in the next edition of our book. So we're constantly trying to address any misconceptions and fallacies that people might think about the National Popular Vote. So what would a campaign look like where every voter is actually relevant? So as we've established, we currently have 2 voters in presidential elections, those in flyover states and those in battleground states, who are hyper relevant. And the people in flyover states, not really relevant. So National Popular Vote corrects this, and we'd see candidates campaigning across the country. Currently in battleground states, turnout of voters is between 9 and 11% points higher. So imagine if we had a nationwide presidential election. Off the bat, you would lift voter turnout, let's call it between the even and say 10%. Lift voter turnout nationwide 10%. Imagine what that does for your down ballot races, that you actually have people knowing, oh, in my state, this is going to matter. And so when they actually go and vote for president because they know that they're not in a decidedly red or decidedly blue state anymore, they vote down the ballot as well. What we've seen in the past presidential elections is that if Florida and Ohio, if they get called early and they get called for a Republican candidate, it depresses voter turnout west of the Mississippi. Because those states that maybe were more contentious, they know, oh, well, they got Ohio and Florida. I don't have to vote. It doesn't matter. People in Alaska and Hawaii, now, I vote on everything on the ballot, but if you only, think I'm going to vote on the presidency or maybe my governor or state or senator, you're probably a lot less likely to go out and vote at, 7:30 on election night before your polls close when you're 5 time zones behind the rest of the country. We don't have to guess about what this would look like because we know when every vote matters. For example, within battleground states, the candidates go all over the state. A vote in Green Bay is just as valuable as a vote in Hayward when Wisconsin is a battleground state. And this is kind of where one of those misconceptions come in where people think, okay, well, they're just going to go to California and New York, and that's it. Well, yes, 18% of the country does live in those 2 states, but if you are going to run a campaign and only talk to potentially 18% of the voters nationwide, you're going to lose. There's no one's going to win under that type of system. Their political consultants are going to map it out and know where everyone is and know that a voter anywhere is a valuable vote for the first time in presidential elections in our nation's history, and so every voter is going to matter. Another common thing that comes up is people say, oh, well, they're just going to go to the coastal states. Okay, yes, roughly 50% of the population lives within 50 miles of the coast. That also means that 50% of the country does not, which includes almost the entire South and like the Bible Belt area. Those are important areas that candidates are still going to have to go to and try and fight for what their ideals are and win over voters there, because every vote's going to be equal no matter where it is cast. So these common objections that I'm going to run through, I think a lot of them just come from a lack of knowledge about how our current system works. And that's okay. A lot of people have not thought about the Electoral College for a long time. I won't say who, but I have had to explain the Electoral College to a state legislator before and how it works. So it's okay that people haven't thought about it for a while. And, these things that come up are natural responses for people to have. But the good news is that with a little bit of facts and data, we can let them know that, hey, it's actually not what you think. So, interstate compacts, here, I don't want to skip over that. So, right off the bat, people might say, oh, that's not constitutional. There's no way. You want a national popular vote for president, you've got to do a constitutional amendment. That's just simply not true. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, the Constitution says that each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors. So state legislatures decide how to apportion their electoral votes. This is a power that the Supreme Court has termed plenary, an absolute power of the state legislature. So it's a state-by-state decision, and that's what we're doing. We're going state by state. We're going to our capitals and saying, Oregon legislature, Governor of Oregon, please adopt this bill for our state. And so that's certainly not something that needs a constitutional amendment. And it's actually one of the only places in the Constitution that the power is very explicitly given to the states. A lot of the other powers that are derived from the Constitution are implied, but this could not be more clear that states get to decide. And there's nothing that says that states can't come together and form a national popular vote like the compact that we're proposing. If there's any people who are lawyers or maybe have just spent a lot of time with the Constitution, as I'm sure lots of league members have, a common question that comes up is about congressional consent. So, the Constitution does say that any interstate compact must get the consent of Congress. However, Congress and the courts quickly realized that that would be a lot of interstate compacts that are just smaller agreements between states having to be approved by Congress. So, in the late 1800s, the Supreme Court ruled that consent is only necessary, congressional consent is only necessary for compacts that encroach upon federal supremacy. So this is important because choosing electors a power explicitly derived in a different part of the Constitution to be a power of the state legislature, does not encroach upon federal supremacy. Furthermore, congressional consent is not required prior to a state legislature's consideration of an interstate compact. So interstate compacts happen all the time. You have the Colorado Water Treaty. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act is an interstate compact that was also entered into with Canada. That is an example of an interstate compact that had to be approved by Congress because it was something that dealt with states having an agreement with a foreign government. Agreements between states on something like this does not require congressional consent. If it did, it's not the norm for states. They can pass it before getting congressional consent. It's not the norm to have it in advance. And we fully expect that whenever this goes into effect, there's going to be lawsuits, right? This is America. We're going to get sued about this immediately. And it's going to go to the Supreme Court. And if at that time the Supreme Court decides to overturn over 100 years of precedent and rule that for some reason this interstate compact has to get congressional consent, that's okay. We'll just go and get congressional consent at that time. And I don't mean to make it sound like that's the easiest thing in the world, but the fact of the matter is that if they determine that we need that consent, it's not impossible to get. You go around and lobby Congress, just like we've lobbied 50 state legislatures across the country. Okay, so I'll pause there for questions on the constitutionality of this compact. Yes?
I don't know if this will go under that, but I have a question about, so the states that have already approved this compact, at the next election next year, will their electoral votes be divided by popular vote?
Great question. So if everyone didn't hear that, the question is, at the next election, for states that are already in the compact, how will their electoral votes be counted? So in the 15 states in DC, their current laws, they all still use winner-take-all laws. So until the compact goes into effect, it's essentially the bill's got a kicker. So every state's law stays the same until that 270 vote threshold is reached. So in the 2020 election, 48 states will still use winner-take-all. Maryland passes in 2007. They've still used winner-take-all for allocating their electoral votes in the 3 elections since that time, and they'll continue to do so until this is in effect. So that's actually one of the features of the bill because, a state, Oregon on its own, now they say, okay, well, yeah, if we were to change our electoral votes to the national popular vote winner, and we're a decidedly blue state, well, we're taking that away from the Democratic candidate. That's who we want to win because that's who the most voters in our state are voting for. So that's why it doesn't go into effect until enough states are signed on that it will change the outcome of the presidency. So once this is in effect, which I really hope and intend for this to be in effect by 2024, that's it. That's how whoever gets the most votes becomes the president. Every time they are the electoral college winner.
So if we do pass this and it's a national thing, is it permanent or?
Great question. That is my next slide, so I will go on to that. So it is not permanent, which is what makes this different than the abolishment of the Electoral College. So I know nationally the league also supports abolishment of the Electoral College. They support a national popular vote for president through either the compact or abolishment of the Electoral College. I talked to state legislators who really like the fact that states can withdraw from the compact if at some point in the future they decide it's not in their best interest. So that's a selling point often with more conservative members of the legislature who we need to vote for the bill. So it's not permanent. My personal opinion is that once we have this first election by national popular vote, you're just going to have more states signing on. But there is a clause for withdrawal within our compact. So states cannot withdraw between July 20th of a presidential year and 6 months later, which is Inauguration Day. So they're locked in to the compact. This is enforced by the impairments clause of the US Constitution. So our compact says, once you're in, you can't withdraw between this time period, and no state in the history of the United States has ever withdrawn from a compact without adhering to the terms of the compact because of the backstop of the Constitution. So that's something that's not enforced by you or I or even like your governor. The United States Supreme Court would say, nope, you pass this law, you're in it for at least this 6-month period and you cannot withdraw. These are really important dates because this includes the party conventions. This includes when people go out and cast their ballots on election day. It includes the safe harbor date for when states have to have their counts in nationwide, which is 6 days before the Electoral College meets, and includes the day that electors meet in their state legislatures to vote. So it's a really important 6 months. And the reason that it's that period, because, well, yeah, we don't want any state legislatures being really malicious and trying to game the system. We don't want them to get to November, October and say, oh gosh, if we had done this under winner take all, maybe my candidate would have won. And it's not looking like they're going to win the national popular vote. The compact has language to prevent that because we're not about trying to game the system. We are trying to make one person, one vote the standard, regardless of who that is going to benefit or whatever political party might win an election. And if people were really concerned about that, even without this, I mean, the Constitution says that they can't withdraw. Furthermore, there's federal law saying that state legislatures cannot change how an elector is chosen after election day. So there's layers actually of like 6 different laws that make it so that there's no chance of state legislatures being able to essentially game the system and change the outcome of the presidency. Once that bill is enacted for 2024, hopefully, July 20th of an election year, whoever gets the most votes becomes the president the next year. That's it. Partisanship. Does that answer your question fully?
Yeah, except I have a problem.
Okay.
I'm a little bit concerned about the fact that you're not putting the legs in there, that once it is, everybody's vote counts, that eventually there'll be a mixture of states that'll just decide we're going to go back to the person who gets the most votes gets all the electoral votes, and that could end up being a disaster.
To revert back, like to have the compact
Like
go into effect and then go out?
Like they did initially. I mean, what Jefferson did, and then there was like this domino effect, and that's a little scary because I perceive that liberal states will definitely keep the pact, and if they keep it and they divide their votes, and then all of these conservative states decide we're going to go with winner versus all. An election comes up, the liberal states are divided with their electoral votes, but the conservative states have all of their votes. That I see that as a problem.
Okay. So the problem that she's raising, the concern, is that you could have this be in effect for 2024, and then say people don't like the system, states don't like the system, and some of the compacting states want to remove themselves from the compact so that they can, that the national popular vote winner is no longer the president. So I just want to say one thing is that any interstate compact, in order for us to get to a national popular vote through the Electoral College, we have to use an interstate compact, and it has to have a withdrawal clause. So we have to provide that to those states because it is a power of the state legislature given to them by the Constitution to determine who these electors are going to be. So we can't change that fact. But what we can reflect on is it's no longer the late 1700s where our state legislatures can do things without us knowing.
Okay.
So we will, if that were...
They did in the state of Wisconsin.
Okay, well...
The closed room.
So there can be things done behind closed doors, but the best that we can do is fight for as much transparency as possible. And if Wisconsin passes this, and then in 2025, you're the one state that wants to remove itself from the compact, that would make it not go into effect, I would certainly hope that everyone in this room would be up in arms at their state legislature just saying, no, we believe in one person, one vote. That is who it should be, regardless of who wins. So I mean, I don't know that I can address what you're saying exactly, because that is how it is. States are able to withdraw. And I think that what it's my job to do, and everyone else's job that supports this bill, is that once it does go into effect, continue the education about it so that people understand how it works. Continue the education of, this is so much better than battleground states and flyover states, and here's why, so that more and more people want to be a part of the compact, so that further down the road, states that are not considering it now might consider it in the future. And I think the next things I'm going to talk about with partisanship might answer some of, or maybe address some of the concerns you might have around that idea too. So in terms of partisanship, this bill is not a reaction to the 2016 election as much as many, many people like to tell me that it is. It was in existence a full decade before Donald Trump was elected. In New York, the Republican state legislature, the Republican Senate, passed the National Popular Vote Compact 3 times before the democratically controlled House would consider it and pass it. In 2018, 15 Republicans and 10 Democratic senators of Michigan sponsored this bill. In 2016, you might have thought that after the 2016 election in 2017, there would be a rush of states eager to pass this bill. We did not pass a single state in 2017. This changed finally in 2018 with Connecticut. And then earlier this year, we passed in Oregon, Delaware, New Mexico, and Colorado. And we passed both chambers of the Nevada legislature only to be vetoed by a Democratic governor. Yeah, so there's, as I said at the beginning, bipartisan opposition and bipartisan support. As I mentioned earlier, I'm from Oregon. I'm from Maryland, actually. I've lived in Oregon the last 3 years. And I became a lobbyist for this bill in this time last year. And it had been blocked for a full decade by the Senate Democratic leader, Peter Courtney. So he's a Democrat. He's leader of his chamber, and he said, I'm not interested in passing this bill. In 2017, he said, no, you don't have enough votes, and wouldn't even bring it to the floor for it to either for an up or down vote. He just would not put it on the floor of the Senate. So this year, we finally were able to force a vote on it. And it was thanks to 2 pretty conservative Republican senators that voted for this bill and advocated for it that we were able to get that vote on the floor. And they were actually the margin, because the Democratic Senate president, the Democratic majority leader, and a 3rd Democratic senator all voted against the bill. So I use that as an example that it is not always who you think is going to support or not support this bill. I think everyone should support it, of course, but people have all different reasons for being opposed to it or being in support of it. Yes?
Are you going to talk more about why people are opposed to it at some point? Because there are people that I've talked to who are also opposed to it, and I need to better understand if I'm going to advocate for it.
Yes.
I need to understand their thinking, where they're coming from.
Yes.
So if at some point we can do that, that would be helpful.
Yes, definitely. So I'm going to go through a couple more specific examples that are what we commonly hear, and then I'll open it up at the end. If you don't feel like I've addressed it there, then we can discuss it. But sometimes, honestly, in Oregon, it was also, once someone had dug in their heels against it, he didn't really want to be persuaded about it. So, I mean, that can come down to it, too, is legislators with egos can be a factor as well.
Legislators have egos?
So, putting that aside, everyone should want this bill in their state, especially people who are the minority in their state. There is no one who should have wanted this to pass more in Oregon than Republicans, because their votes are essentially thrown out at the state line and never counted. Oregon hasn't gone gone red since the early 80s, and it's probably not going to for I don't know how long, maybe ever again if we have winner take all. So that's they should be interested in it, because we're looking at passing this bill in Virginia right now. And Virginia, as I think people might know, since it was very recently in the news, just flipped both of their chambers to be democratically controlled. The Republicans in Southern Virginia have a lot more in common with Republicans in Kentucky or in Tennessee than they do with Northern Virginia. So they have this system where their votes are now going to be thrown out too. They don't feel like they have enough of a voice. And that's what they already have at the state capitol now, that they're going to be having this for the first time in, I don't know, over 2 decades. So they should come together under a national popular vote. Their votes will be counted up with all of the people in Texas and in rural Kentucky and rural Tennessee. And they'll be able to come together and have a candidate who speaks to everyone across the country, not just people in swing states.
I ask a question. So what do you say to a person in a swing state that is happy to have the extra attention to them and the extra money thrown to them, that you're now not going to have that anymore?
Okay. Well, I would say, one, because of changing demographics and how often swing states change, you probably wouldn't have had it in 8 years anyway, 4 to 8 years in the next 2 elections, because swing states change. So there's one thing. And I would say, if as a person in a swing state, that you might want to look at that longer trajectory of what power am I going to have over time. But also just say, do you really think that's fair? That for a short amount of time you get to benefit from this, while states like New York don't get disaster declarations for humongous hurricanes that cause billions of dollars of damage. So I think sometimes you can just take it back to that core emotional level. Like, do you think that's right? So another reason why everyone should want this. So Democrats thought that they had a blue wall in 2016 that was never going to be broken, and that they were going to win the Electoral College for years to come because they were building up these majorities. And then they lost states that they hadn't lost in decades. Similarly, if Republicans are looking at the longer term landscape, I would be pretty concerned about the fact that there's talk of Texas going blue. Now, personally, I don't think Texas is going to go blue in 2020, but the fact that that's even a topic for conversation can tell you that it might in 2024 or 2028. And with our current demographics, it is very unlikely for the Republicans to be able to win a majority of electoral votes if they don't have Texas's 38 electoral votes. They might be able to win a national popular vote, but not if they, under a winner-take-all system, if they don't have those 38 electoral votes from Texas. Similarly, we're seeing shifting populations in Florida. Of course, you can never assume that any particular community is homogeneously Democratic or Republican, but you can recognize that things are shifting. In Florida, we have a lot of American citizens who were from Puerto Rico moving into Florida and now able to vote in their elections. We also have a lot of, I think 1.4 returning citizens who are now going to be able to vote in elections moving forward in Florida. That's a big shift that's going to change on if Florida goes red or blue over time. And if it becomes a state that is blue and can't be won by Republicans for 10 years, they're going to have a hard time winning the Electoral College. So let's put all of our political party cards aside and say, this is a national popular vote is what is best for Americans nationwide and what makes the most sense. Let's have 2 candidates go on stage, debate the 2 topics, talk about the things that matter to people all across the country. We go on election day and we vote, and whoever gets the most votes wins. It's not a crazy idea. It's something we can do, and that's the way that we should elect the president, I think. Another thing is national security. So if we want to make our elections more secure, if anyone, foreign or bodies of government or just any political candidate or consultant, is looking to swing the presidential election, it is a lot easier to do that when you only have to shift through fraud or disenfranchisement a few thousand votes in a handful of key swing districts in closely divided battleground states. I would say that's a thing that you got to really think about. In Florida, if you could swing 5,000 votes and change the outcome of the presidency, doesn't that sound a lot easier than altering 3 million votes nationwide to overcome a defeat in the popular vote? So this is something that, by nature of making the pool that much bigger, you're making your election stronger against any kind of fraud or disenfranchisement. There are, of course, other reforms for electing the president. There's the three big ones, congressional district approach. So this is how Maine and Nebraska currently choose their electors. So it retains the existing statewide winner-take-all approach but within congressional districts. So it's a district level district level winner-take-all. It can be implemented either by state law, or it could be implemented nationwide through a constitutional amendment. And Maine has used this since 1969, and Nebraska has used this since 1992. I sum up my response to this particular approach as, do we really need one more reason to gerrymander congressional districts? And also, it does not achieve one person, one vote. Some of you might be familiar with the graphic I have on the right. This is the ugly Jerry font that was created earlier this year. So it's letters of the alphabet using gerrymandered congressional districts. So there's obviously already a lot of incentive to do this for more representation in the House. I don't want them to be having another reason to gerrymander districts for the presidential election as well. So there's also the whole number proportional approach, which divides a state's electoral votes to the nearest whole number based on the number of popular votes that a candidate receives in their state. Because it doesn't divide electoral votes, it can be implemented again by state law in an individual state, but again, it doesn't achieve one person, one vote. It's just changing our system to something arguably worse and definitely not better. Also, we have abolishing the Electoral College. So this is a direct popular election of the president through a constitutional amendment. In 1969, the U.S. House of Representatives approved on a bipartisan vote, 338 to 70, a constitutional amendment sponsored by Representative Seller, but the proposal died in the Senate. That was the last time in our nation's history that we really got close to abolishing the Electoral College. Even though it has been regularly introduced as a congressional proposal. So if it were to be passed by Congress, you would still it would need to be passed by 2/3 of the House of Representatives, 2/3 of the Senate, and ratified by 3/4 of the states, which is currently 38 out of our 50 states. Or it could also be accomplished through a constitutional convention called by 2/3 of the state legislatures. However, we as a country have never actually called a convention. So that's there, but very unlikely. So it achieves one person, one vote, but does not retain the state's ability to change their laws on allocation of electors, which, as I mentioned, is something that people is something that legislators support. So these, the next item is small states. So this is something people think a lot, that small states have an inherent advantage under our current system, but they actually don't. The small states, so the 13 states with 3 or 4 electoral votes, are actually the most disadvantaged and ignored groups of states under our winner-take-all system. Political power does not come from being a big state, but from being a closely divided battleground state. And almost all of our states are small states are non-competitive in presidential general elections. So under our current state-by-state winner-take-all system, a vote for president in Wyoming is actually equal to a vote for president in California because they're both politically irrelevant. The 8 smallest states together received only one of the nation's 952 general election campaign events between 2008 and 2016, compared to Wisconsin, in that same time frame, received 40 events. So you received more attention despite only having 10 electoral votes compared to the 24 electoral votes of those states. So our current system actually shifts power from voters in the small and medium-sized states to voter in a handful of big states. So serious candidates for office know that every vote matters under a national popular vote, and they will solicit every vote. So a voter in a small state would become as important as any other in the U.S. And if you look at it, the 13 smallest states currently have approximately the same population as Ohio. And no one would say that Ohio doesn't matter in presidential elections. And within the state of Ohio, every vote counts. So some small states are already on board with national popular vote, so it's not inherently opposed by them. And they're on board with it because they know it would be better for them. Delaware, Hawaii, Vermont, and DC. And public support for our proposal actually runs slightly higher in these small states than it does nationwide. Similarly, the Electoral College was not there to inherently protect rural states either. They're generally not battleground states, and as a result, the winner-take-all method of awarding electors diminishes their influence. None of these states are closely divided battleground states. This shows just rural population of the states. Big cities, this is something that comes up a lot. So it's a common misconception that people think that big cities will decide an election. I think this stems from people thinking that cities are a lot bigger than they actually are. 15% of the U.S. population lives in the United States' 50 largest cities. When you make that number the 100 largest cities, you go from 15% to 16%. So to win a national popular vote campaign, you can't just campaign to city dwellers or rural America. You have to speak to the 2/3 of Americans who live in the suburbs and are evenly divided between Democrats and Republicans. That's who lives in the larger metropolitan statistical area, but not in the urban core. That's where 2/3 of our country lives. And those people are evenly divided when it comes to political parties. Some people think that the Electoral College was put into place to protect against large cities deciding our election. To that, I would counter that 95% of the United States population in 1790 lived in places with fewer than 2,500 people. So the idea that big cities controlling an election was on the Founding Fathers' mind doesn't really hold water. This is the 50 biggest cities, which constitutes 15% of our population. Down here is Milwaukee, the largest city in Wisconsin. We are right behind you, my city of Portland. I think we might potentially surpass you after the next census. Another common objection is that candidates will campaign everywhere, that candidates won't campaign everywhere. They'll just stick to the major media markets of New York and LA and other big cities. But that's kind of one of those things you guys got to stop and say, no, everyone lives in a media market, and it's a lot less expensive to run ads in those outside of those really large urban areas. We have TV, we have radio, we have newspapers and magazines, and now we know the extent to which we have direct targeted advertising with social media. It's a lot easier to reach people through a couple of clicks on a Facebook or Twitter ad than it is to hope that they might see an ad running in Times Square or on a big show that runs nationwide. So no, they'll campaign everywhere, not just in these big media markets. Recounts is something that gets brought up a lot as a question. So a recount would be less likely under a national popular vote than our current statewide winner-take-all system. There have been 5 litigated state recounts in our 57 presidential elections. That is a rate that is dramatically higher than the 1 in 185 elections that are typically require a recount under a winner-take-all system within a single-member district. So again, I think this is somewhere where people get caught up, mostly probably because they don't really necessarily know how our votes are counted now. And so a recount seems like this kind of confusing thing. The big takeaway for this is that the National Popular Vote Compact only changes one thing, and that is who goes and casts their ballots when electors meet in December from each state. That's it. We don't change recount laws, so whatever laws you currently have in Wisconsin will still apply. So this is actually what happens with our ballots. So we cast our ballots on Election Day. Per the Constitution, it has to happen in the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. That evening, precinct tallies are calculated. Final vote tallies from precincts across the state are sent to the Secretary of State, and they either go to the town or county level, depending on what state you're in. There's a safe harbor date. This is a matter of federal law. That 6 days prior to electors meeting in their state legislatures and casting their ballots, every Secretary of State has to have resolved any disputes about votes. So that it won't be this idea that recounts could be going on until January and we won't know who the president is. No, federal law says they have to have all of that figured out by 6 days before electors meet. And any conflicts have to be resolved. So then after that date, everyone will know who the national popular vote winner is. The secretaries of state in the compacting states will be able to say, okay, this is who got the most votes nationwide. That means that we should send candidate A or candidate B's electors to cast their ballots in my state of Salem in the Capitol. So they send a certificate of ascertainment to the electors, showing what the vote totals are nationwide. And that is what has to happen either before or on the day that electors meet. And then they meet and cast their ballots in their respective state houses. Yes?
Just a tiny point of fact. In Wisconsin, it's not the Secretary of State that does that. It's the Wisconsin Elections Commission.
Thank you. So yeah, the idea that these could go on and on and on just simply isn't true. It's a matter of federal law that these items are built in to protect against that kind of reality. And here in Wisconsin specifically, so you actually have to have the count in no later than 14 days after the general election, which I think is actually November 17th. You would have to have the number in for the state. So it's 3 weeks earlier than what the rest of the country has to have by federal law. So a lot of states have these earlier dates as well. Okay, and then faithless electors. So this is one I bring up only because it's popping up in the news a lot lately. It's not something I've historically been asked about a lot until the last couple of months. I'm going to start by simply saying that the faithless elector issue broadly and the current court activity around this issue doesn't impact the compact. So a faithless elector is a person who is selected by the Democratic or Republican Party of their state, and when they go to cast their ballot, they choose not to cast their ballot for the candidate that they were pledged to. Some states have laws binding electors to the person that they are pledged to. This is a matter of state law. After 2016, we had several faithless electors that year of people that defected from Hillary Clinton and voted for someone else. Some of that has been litigated since, and there are now 2 opposing court rulings that are being determined on if a state is actually allowed to replace an elector if they don't vote for who they're pledged to. That's being considered by the Supreme Court, and I expect we'll see a ruling on that next year. But the thing to think about if anyone asks you about this is that the compact only changes what electors, either representing the Democratic or Republican candidate, go and cast their ballots. It doesn't change any other matter of state law that might punish them or make their ballots null and void if they cast it for someone else. That is a matter of a different state law, and it's up to the candidate or party to choose the right people who won't defect. So a simple solution is that states could also change a separate state law and have the candidates choose their own electors. This is what's done in Pennsylvania. So that's a different thing that could be done to, get around this issue. Here in Wisconsin, I don't know if everyone knows this, but you have a really interesting system. The elected leaders of your party meet in the Capitol and select one elector from each congressional district and 2 at-large districts. So it's like whoever just won in the primaries for state senator and like your county party leaders and your state party leaders come together and pick people to represent each of the congressional districts and then 2 at-large electors. They're often nationwide party activists, donors, sometimes legislators. In my state, it's the chair and vice chair of the party and then the chairs of each congressional district. So if this comes up, the simple thing that you can say to people is that it's a separate issue than national popular vote. Our compact is not affected by faithless electors since we just changed one thing. So I'm now going to take any questions about the compact, and then any organizing type questions we'll do after our short lunch break. So did I not get to any of the questions we had earlier?
Can you flip back to that slide about how Wisconsin's timing for the submitting the...
The one before that?
Oh, no. I think you just had it.
The faithless electors.
No, this one, okay.
Yeah, so it's just after your general election, whatever your count is
Oh,
has to be determined within 14 days.
hang on, 7 days after, okay, that's only when the county clerk has to submit it to, it's not the Government Accountability Board anymore, it's the Wisconsin Elections Commission. I think the state date the Wisconsin Elections Commission has to certify is the federal safe harbor date.
Oh, okay.
So you see, this statute is only about the county clerk's deadline, not the Elections Commission deadline.
Okay, well, thank you. So then the other point still stands that by the safe harbor date, that's the date nationwide, regardless of each individual state law. So thank you for that. Sir, what about you? What about the questions on objections that people have? Do you have other things that have come up often or things I didn't touch on here?
Yeah, I'm interested in the partisan objection. And I understand what you've said, but I'm still struggling with understanding why in some states Democrats would oppose it, like in your state. In other states, the Republicans would oppose it.
Mm-hmm.
If it's going to change the power structure in that state, I would anticipate there's going to be a lot of partisan,
Yeah.
yeah.
So it is a nonpartisan bill that people absolutely make partisan, right?
True, but that's the reality of our environment, is that people make it partisan.
Yes. So Republicans that oppose it historically are because the two most recent elections that this has happened in, they benefited at a national level. So they don't necessarily always sit in a room with me for 3 hours and go over the different topics. They just say, nope, it's good for me now. It's going to continue to be good for me in the future. So they don't want to do that deeper dive and look into the different inherent biases that they might have around that. Similarly, Democrats think, oh, 2016 was a fluke. We have the blue wall. We're going to continue to get bluer and it won't matter. In my state, different people opposed it for different reasons. The opposition that came up, which I think was a little bit of an excuse, was that it should be referred to the voters for them to decide. If you want the popular vote for president, let the popular vote decide. But in my particular state, that we didn't accept that because that was just an excuse. They refused to put it on for a vote on the Senate floor, and we're trying to automatically refer it without even taking a vote on it first. We said, no, this is your job. We elected you to vote on issues first. If then it has to be referred, okay, but vote on it as is first. So some of that is just them coming up partisanship. The Senate Majority Leader several times said, and it said this in town halls, well, but if the Republican gets the most nationwide votes, they'll get Oregon's electoral votes. And she just did not like that idea and thought that that was like a boogeyman tactic that would get other people to not support it. And we said, yeah, because they didn't get the most votes nationwide. We put aside this idea that it should be who represents the state in the electoral college, because we believe in trying to achieve a national popular vote for president, and that whoever represents just my state is not necessarily who should matter. It should be whoever the most amount of Americans elect.
Bringing us back to national popular vote, one of the reasons we're doing this now is it's an education process, right? We're all learning it. We're pretty attuned to what goes on politically as a league. And who understood electoral college, number one? Who understands what the national popular vote is and how it's implemented, right? We're learning it. So the idea of doing all of this is so that we all can learn it. We can put on other seminars and presentations to teach our communities. We can have cocktail parties or out for coffee, talk to our neighbors, because it's a process. And I think, and how many times do we have to hear it before we understand it? Yes, 7 times is what they teach us. And it's true, it's complicated. I mean, once you know it, it doesn't seem complicated, but as you're learning it, it seems complicated. So that's why we're doing this now, because one, our legislature maybe could change, maybe could change, which is one thing. And if we're talking about, well, maybe it won't change next year, maybe in 4 years or whatever. And the referendum thing ties in because you're getting the public involved. And if they go out, they can't vote for this till they understand it. No one's going to go out and vote for it till they understand it. Mm-hmm. So that's what we're trying to lay the groundwork.
Yeah, I'm just going to bring this back. So we do have 45 minutes after lunch to talk about how to be an advocate. And so I think we'll do a little bit of a deeper dive on this kind of